Yellow Submarine is the 10th studio album by the English rock band The Beatles, released on January 13, 1969 in the United States and on January 17, 1969 in the United Kingdom. It was issued as the soundtrack to the animated film of the same name, which premiered in London in July 1968. The album contains 6 songs by The Beatles, of which Yellow Submarine and All You Need Is Love had previously been released as singles. The remainder of the album was a re-recording of the film's orchestral soundtrack by the band's producer, George Martin. The project was regarded as a contractual obligation by the Beatles, who were asked to supply 4 new songs for the film. Some songs were written and recorded specifically for the soundtrack, while others were unreleased tracks from other projects. The album was issued 2 months after the White Album and was therefore not viewed by the band as a significant release. Yellow Submarine has since been afforded a mixed reception from music critics, some of whom consider that it falls short of the high standard generally associated with the Beatles' work. It reached the top 5 in the UK and the US, and has been reissued on compact disc several times. Background and recording: the album arose from contractual obligations for the Beatles to supply new songs to the soundtrack to United Artists' animated film Yellow Submarine. Having recently completed their album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in April 1967, the group showed minimal enthusiasm for the project. Along with the music for their Magical Mystery Tour TV film, the Yellow Submarine soundtrack was part of a period that author Ian MacDonald later described as the band's regime of continuous low-intensity recording. It had a workaday quality about it, an intrinsic lack of tension which was bound to color the resulting material. Only one side of the album contains songs performed by the Beatles. Of the 6, 4 were previously unreleased. Yellow Submarine had been issued in August 1966 as a single, topping the UK chart for 4 weeks, and had also been released on the album Revolver. All You Need Is Love had been issued as a single in July 1967. Of the unreleased tracks, the first to be recorded was George Harrison's Only a Northern Song, during the sessions for Sgt. Pepper. It was taped in February 1967 but subsequently shelved, along with an unfinished instrumental written by Harrison. The song was originally titled Not Known, and the lyrics reflect Harrison's dismay at being merely a contracted songwriter to the Beatles' publishing company, Northern Songs. All Together Now was recorded in a single session on May 12, 1967, specifically for the film project. The title came from a phrase Paul McCartney had heard as a child, to encourage everyone to sing music hall songs. He later described the song as a throwaway. The band recorded Harrison's It's All Too Much in late May 1967. The Beatles had unlimited studio time to experiment and record whatever songs came to hand at Abbey Road, but this session took place at Delane Lee Studios. The original take ran for over 8 minutes, and Harrison briefly quoted a line from the Murseys' 1966 song Sorrow. John Lennon's Hey Bulldog was recorded on February 11, 1968 and evolved from an initial intent to shoot a promotional film for the single Lady Madonna. Like All Together Now, it was specifically recorded with the film soundtrack in mind. The track's ending featured a jam session after the point where a fade-out was intended in the final mix, which was kept in the finished version. Side 2 features a re-recording of the symphonic film score composed by Martin, specifically for the album. The recording took place with a 41-piece orchestra over 2 3-hour sessions on 22nd and 23rd October 1968 in Abbey Road, and edited down to the length on the LP on November 22. Martin's arrangement quoted from his earlier work for the Beatles. For example, Sea of Time includes a brief extract of a melody from Within You Without You from Sgt. Pepper. Release: a film received its worldwide premiere in London in July 1968, by which time the Beatles were busy working on their eponymous double album, The Beatles, commonly called The White Album. Ultimately, the Beatles were enthusiastic about the finished film, and did more to associate themselves with it after release. Having been delayed so that it would not clash with the release of The Beatles, Yellow Submarine was issued by Apple Records on January 13, 1969 in the US and on January 17 in the UK. The album was issued in stereo only in the US, while the UK album was available in both stereo and mono, although the mono version is simply a fold-down rather than a specific mix. Since All You Need Is Love had been Rush-released as single, it did not have an official stereo mix. Although the track was released on the US LP Magical Mystery Tour, an official stereo mix of the track was not made until October 29, 1968 for the album. In the US, 8-track tape versions featured Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds as an extra song on side 2. Artwork. The artwork on the sleeve contains a drawing of the Beatles as featured on trailer posters, created by Heinz Edelman. The same basic design was used for the UK and US covers, though the UK jacket contains the words "Nothing Is Real" just below the album's title, while the US version did not. On the back of the cover, the UK album contained a review of the White Album written for The Observer by Tony Palmer. The review was introduced by a few liner notes by Apple press officer Derek Taylor. The US cover contained a fictitious illustrated biography by Dan Davis of the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, in which the ensemble's battle with the Blue Meanies was compared to 3 other epic struggles in the history of the English-speaking world: Beowulf's struggle to save the hero at Mead Hall, King John's signing of the Magna Carta, and Thomas Jefferson's writing of the Declaration of Independence. Unreleased EP. After mixed response to the album upon release, the Beatles considered releasing Yellow Submarine as a 5-track mono EP without the film score but including the then unreleased Across the Universe as a bonus track. The EP was mastered but never issued. The original running order for the EP was only A Northern Song, Hey Bulldog, and Across the Universe on side 1, with All Together Now, and It's All Too Much on side 2. Reissues. The first compact disc release appeared in August 1987. It is consistent with the English version of the LP. The running order is the same, with Sea of Time and Sea of Holes as separate tracks. The Nothing Is Real subtitle remains intact, and the review of the White Album with Taylor's introduction is included inside the CD insert. The album appeared in a revised version on September 13, 1999, coinciding with the remastered re-release of the film. Titled Yellow Submarine Songtrack, it dispenses with the George Martin orchestrations, and includes the 6 Beatles songs from the original album, along with an additional 9 songs, all completely remixed for this disc. The original album was remastered and reissued, along with the rest of the Beatles catalogue, on September 9, 2009. This release included both the UK and US sleeve notes. The mono mixes of the 4 songs that were intended for the unreleased EP were released for the first time on the Mono Masters collection as part of the box set The Beatles in Mono. Reception. In contrast to the animated film, Yellow Submarine was not generally considered to be a significant release. Issued 2 months after the Beatles, it was one of the few Beatles releases that failed to top the charts in either the United Kingdom or the United States, peaking instead at number 3 and number 2, respectively. In Canada, Yellow Submarine topped the RPM National Albums chart for 2 weeks, ending the White Album's 12-week run at number 1. On America's Billboard Top LPs chart, it was kept from the top by the same album. Recalling the release in a special edition issue of Mojo magazine, Peter Doggett writes that the papers got all trippy for Yellow Submarine. Beat instrumental bemoaned the paucity of new material by the band, but added, "Be not of bad cheer. The George Martin score to the film is really very nice, and 2 tracks by George Harrison redeem the first side. Both songs are superb pieces, considerably more enthralling than the most draggy All Together Now, a rather wet track." In a review for International Times, Barry Miles considered Martin's score superbly produced, and, of the songs, wrote only of It's All Too Much, which he described as, variously, endless, mantric, around, interwoven, trellised, tessellated, filigreed, jive-eyed, spiraling, and happy sing-along music. According to Beatles historian Mark Lewison, however, the band were mildly criticized at the time for failing to provide their customary excellent value for money with the soundtrack album. More recently, AllMusic critic Richie Unterberger has written of Yellow Submarine, "The album would have been far better value if it had been released as a 4-song EP. with the addition of a bonus track in Across the Universe. No one would argue that there's a huge amount more than meets the eye there, but listening to the original album a new 40 years on, one is still struck by how mostly second-rate, and recycled and rejected Beatles material still sounds so good. Writing for Pitchfork Media, Mark Richardson opines that the Yellow Submarine soundtrack is like the work of a supremely talented band that couldn't really be bothered, and describes Hey Bulldog as a tough and funky piano-driven rocker, and by a good margin the best song here. Richardson concludes, but as an album it's ultimately forgettable, which is something the Beatles so rarely were otherwise. Pop Matters' David Gussman views Martin's selections as kind of twee and inconsequential, and the 4 new songs on side 1 as fascinating, adding that the material's tossed-off origins give it a character unlike any other Beatles album. While noting that the soundtrack was superseded with the 1999 release of Yellow Submarine's songtrack, Gussman writes, "No matter how you get them, though, the otherwise unavailable songs on this album ought to be part of any thinking Beatles fans' collection." Alex Young of Consequence of Sound writes, "As a whole, Yellow Submarine is a delightful album, even if it's still a less than acceptable inclusion in the Beatles canon, though he criticized the inclusion of Martin's score which he felt should have been sold as a separate release." Track listing: all songs written and composed by Lennon-McCartney, except Only a Northern Song, and It's All Too Much, by George Harrison. All songs written and composed by George Martin, except Yellow Submarine in Pepperland, by Lennon-McCartney. Certifications: BPI certification awarded only for sales since 1994. Notes, footnotes. Citations. Sources. Further reading: Lewis on, Mark. The Complete Beatles Chronicle. Chancellor Press. ISBN 0-7607-0327-2. External links: official website.